Chloe, please go ahead.
Yes, so everyone, thank you for joining from different continents. And thank you for making, especially for those audience in Hong Kong, thank you for making time for joining this quite late night discussion. Today, we will have a discussions with Fredie and Grants on the titled as Performing Islands. We will use Hong Kong and Jeju as an example to see how island can be studied and can be performed via different types of artistic practice. We have Lambo here tonight as well. She is the program curator of the in the first series of the island programs. So right now I will pass my time to Lambo to introduce the speakers a bit, as well as introduce our moderators tonight, Ka Lee. So here you go, Lambo.
Okay. Hi. Good evening or good morning to everyone. So I'm speaking from Hong Kong here, and I'm Lampo. And because water is borderless, so tonight we are connected between 3 continents. And let's welcome our discussant Ka Lee and the 2 artists tonight. That is Grant Leuning and Fredie Chan Ho Lun. And I met Ka Lee and Grant earlier this year in an e-conference, similar setting like tonight, about Asian coloniality. And back then the conversation made me to think of Fredie immediately, because both artists share much in common, I think. And thanks to WMA giving us the chance to bring everyone here and have a chance to bring our conversation to a wider audience. So let me introduce Ka Lee. Ka Lee Wong is a Dosai fellow in the Department of East Asian Languages and Culture at the University of Southern California. She earned her PhD in USC. Her research interests include the dialectic relationship between language and identity in transnational Chinese media. I think, Ka Lee, you can explain more about your enthusiasm in maybe Sinophone or sonic environment, right, tonight. And then Grant Leuning is an artist and writer in San Diego, California. His work uses poetry, collective productions, and experimental themes to confront the displays of border and military installations. He is also a PhD candidate at the University of California, San Diego, and he's now writing a dissertation on aesthetics and politics on Jeju Island in Korea. So cross-border scholarship. Yeah. And Fredie, my old friend, he earned international award. He is an international award-winning documentary filmmaker and a scholarship recipient. And he is now studying MA film directing at the University of Edinburgh. His films cover urban grassroots activism and Hong Kong real culture, including titles like The Weight of Paddy. Is that what's the Chinese title, Fredie?
稻米是如何煉成的生活館。
稻米是如何煉成的。And then Open Road After Harvest. So the Chinese title is
收割開路。收割開路。
收割開路。And then Rind 收割開路。And then Rind of 水口。水口is a coastal community in Lantern Island. So I passed the time to Ka Lee, and I think maybe we'll need some introductions to the locality of their practices first. Please,
sure,
Ka Lee.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lampo, for the introduction. So before I begin, I'd like to thank Lampo and WMA, especially Chloe and Hay, to arrange this conversation. I'm very happy here to discuss the really inspiring works by Fredie and Grant. Today, we will focus a few aspects such as performance and the sonic in their media making about what island or the islandic communities are facing in Hong Kong and also Jeju. So one common thread I saw in both of your work is that, and like the things that we're gonna talk about, from your documentary by Fredie, Fisherman Discourse and Grant's Poetry. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce the Hangul, but it is an experimental subjectification tactic for use on hostile object and also line gather rock in a way. And these works are about the impacts of different kinds of developments on islands to its population. Then we see how fishermen in Hong Kong or villagers in Jeju, in Korea, lost their home at or near the ocean because of different reasons, either urbanization like land reclamation or media or military policy like building a naval base on the rock. So Fredie and Grant express these impacts very differently, but I think putting your work together in a conversation actually allows us to have a very constructive conversation about the concern among the islandic and oceanic studies. So currently in island and ocean studies, there have been a call to study islands as archipelago, that is islands as a network. By that, scholars emphasize that islands aren't isolated nor static, and they aren't always only marked with things like shortage or dependency. Instead, archipelago, the focus is on relationality and connections, like how the ocean is a place of connections and how islands and the islandic community can become an alliance, like using each other's experience to sustain their survival or initiate changes. So I think today our conversation can achieve this goal because it will give us more reference points to enrich and strengthen the island studies in the inter-Asian context. So before we begin, I think we should invite Fredie and Grant to talk a little bit about the idea behind their works, particularly the background, like what was really happening in the selected location in Hong Kong and also Jeju. So I will pass the mic to Grant or Fredie.
Grant, would you like to start first?
Sure, I can start first. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So my work took place, the films took place in a small town called Gangjung. Gangjung is on the south coast of Jeju Island. Jeju Island is about 100 kilometers off the south coast of Korea. So it's very nearly the most southern point in the nation of Korea by about 15 kilometers. And it's one of the longest inhabited places. There's inhabitations that go back about 10,000 years in this site. And about 15 years ago, it was forcibly chosen by the Korean government as the site for a new military base. And the site that was chosen for that military base was the traditional gathering place of the town, which was a rock called Gurumbi. And the rock being the foundation of this town was destroyed with dynamite and became the foundation for this military base. Since then, it's been a site of continual occupation by the Gangjung villagers, first to protest and block the construction. And then once the construction was completed, to every single day have performances, bows, a Catholic protest mass, and a march on the base to keep up the resistance to this site. I'm very happy that we brought up this idea of archipelago because Jeju takes great strength from islands like Hawaii and Okinawa, which have very similar struggles against US militarization, against the imposition of bases opposed to the wishes of the native inhabitants, and that have seen daily and continual struggles against these bases. So when I went and I worked in Gangjung, I'll be back there this fall, I worked with them on these daily performances and decided to contribute my own performances, which addressed the level of the sonic, but also addressed the base as a subjectivity. With that back, I'll just give a short background on the films. I took the concept of the interval from Gilles Deleuze as this variable present, or the gap between action and reaction. And one of the things I learned very viscerally in Gangjung is how do you continue to keep up both a peaceful persistence, but also maintain a bit of contempt. Because if the resistance to the coming future or lack thereof is one that is limited in its capacity for military action, it's not limited in its capacity or it's not limited to kindness. That's not necessarily the only route possible. And my reasoning was we are all sort of imprisoned by our subjectivities. We are caught in our hesitations. We question whether we're doing the right thing. We fail in our strategizing. And the objects which impose this hesitation on us are not limited in the same way. So I thought we might get a little revenge and attempt to impose the hesitation of subjectivity onto the military base that was imposing on us. So I did a series of sound recordings around the base and then projected them back at the base at different angles and from different positions around the base, and repeated the poem from the piece called Onolin Mokyoil, or Today is Thursday, in order to build a rhythm into the base that gave it that, for me, quintessentially human moment of forgetting what day it is. Is today Thursday? Is today Friday? And I wanted to build that hesitation into the base and give it that moment, because if it had that hesitation, that immediate temporal hesitation, it might hesitate about what it's doing to the area, what it's done to the rock, what it continues to do to threaten peace in the region, and what it continues to do to the culture and stability of Jeju Island as a place which is, if you're not familiar, overrun with tourism. It's an island of 600,000 people who gets 20 million tourists a year. And the South Korean government's attempting to make that 40 million tourists a year. So if these objects were forced to reflect in some way on these processes, my hope is that they would perhaps get sick and leave. I will also mention that this is part of a project that I have here in San Diego, where we address the same thing to the US-Mexico border wall, which is one of the deadliest border walls in the world, kills about 5,000 people a year. And we have a similar procedure, but here it's a visual procedure, it's a video procedure, whereas on Jeju is primarily sound recordings and vibrations. With that, I'll pass it to Fredie.
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Grant. I have prepared 3 slides to share, just to give you very brief introductions about the documentary, where did I make the movies, and what is the meaning of shooting fishermen in Hong Kong. So can all of you see the photos, the slides? Yep, okay, thanks. So, yep, so just to give you a very brief introduction of where did I make the film, this Fisherman Discourse, and the symbolic meaning of shooting fishermen in a contemporary context, and why the image of fishermen attractive to me. And the main reason is that because if you want to tell the story of Hong Kong or about the birth of Hong Kong, we always refer to fishermen. It's classic pictures. And so this is where, with the red arrow, you can see at the red arrow, some Peng Chau. If you land in Hong Kong, the first place that you will see is Lantau Island, where is the Hong Kong International Airport. And Peng Chau is just a small island behind Lantau, and with a quite small populations in Peng Chau. And you can also see there's quite a lot of small outlying islands in Hong Kong as well. And some people, some fishermen, they still live in the island and make a living by fishing. and a little bit of agriculture as well. And the second characters that I cover in the documentaries, he used to do fishing in Causeway Bay, whereas in Hong Kong Island, the red arrow on the right side. So the documentary basically was made in these two spots. And okay, there you go. So why I think the image of a fisherman attractive to me, because as I said, if you want to tell the Hong Kong story about the birth of Hong Kong, we always refer to fishermen. It is a quite dominant narrative. Both British colonial government or Chinese government nowadays will use fishermen as a symbol to show the past and the presence of Hong Kong, from a fisherman's village to international trading hub, or from a barren rocks to an Asian powerhouse. However, the fisherman is always a symbol of backward, underdeveloped, rural, of nostalgia's Hong Kong to justify the civilization and decent metropolitan life that we have today. And before shooting that short film, 15-minute short film, I have a question. Is everyone enjoying the decent life in Hong Kong nowadays? So how about where are the fishermen now that we could see in historical images? What are they doing? Do they still exist? If it is such an important image to learn about Hong Kong history. So that was the first initiative. And until I have a chance that I could do this small documentary films with the commission, then it was my first time to go shooting the fishermen. Like, okay. So boat is a symbol to be consumed nowadays by the Hong Kong Tourism Board. If you look at Hong Kong, what is Hong Kong? Where should you go? What would you do as a tourist to Hong Kong? They always refer to this boat. They always suggest you to spend time, sit in the boat, enjoy your time in the Victoria Harbour. However, where are the people living and surviving in the sea nowadays? What are their voices? It's a quite rare topic. And Urban Diary gave me a chance, commissioned me to make this film. So that was my first chance to cover people actually living in the island and make their living in the sea. The life in Ireland, or what's going on in Ireland, is quite quiet. Although I'm always looking for some stories that vulnerable people or underrepresented groups that they can come together so that their livelihood. Sadly, in the island, there's not much going on, but it doesn't mean that there's no stories. And I found that there's such an unseen space. Sea is an unseen space in Hong Kong that you can rarely see what's going on. But actually, how can you get the information about what's going on in the sea? I think the fishermen, it's the least informant. And if you want to know the influence of land reclamation and urban developments from the seas, from islanders' perspective, you go on the boat with the fishermen, then you will have a quite fresh perspective. So it was the reason why I really enjoyed shooting this short film, and it was my first time actually. And I'm quite happy to see the exhibition that we cover quite a lot. And I think it is the first events that we concentrate the voices about the islanders in an exhibition in Hong Kong. I've never seen that before. I'm quite happy to see that, because this film was made in 2013. 9 years ago, there was not much discussion about the sea and the island as well. And I could see it takes quite a long time to accumulate different artworks to be fruitful enough to make up this event. And I'm quite happy to see this exhibition. And thank you for organizing this.
Thank you so much, Freddie and Grant. So it is really interesting. Freddie said that like you feel that like on islands there's a sense of nothing really going on. I guess it is especially true for like us non-islanders because there's somehow like because of the distance it's really hard to know what's really going on unless like media cover it, right? But you both found a really great and inspiring angle as an intervention of the critical issues at hand. So one of the critical issue that I think it is great if we can talk about would be how you deal with the sense of loss, because in your media we saw that the island, the ocean, they were a place for population, for a living, or a social place for gathering. But then it became a no place because of different reasons that we have already mentioned. So there are a few really striking and powerful moments in both of your work I want to point out. So for example, in Freddie's Fisherman Discourse, you compare the competition on land to that of the sea, and a fisherman said even fish became homeless, not just fishermen. And in Grant's piece, Blind Gather Rock, in a way, you said Gurumbi is a gathering place. The struggle is a struggle to stay. Many people got stuck on the rock and still stick. So here we see this shared anxiety of loss in both Hong Kong and Jeju. And it would be great if you can share a little bit about your creative process when dealing with this sense of loss. And I guess the audience may be also interested in knowing some of the anecdotes during your media making process.
Yeah, maybe I can talk about the production process a little bit. So I chose documentary as my medium simply because I'm a documentary filmmaker. It is the best skills I acquire and I feel confident. And but even so, you still have lots of ways to make a documentary. For example, you can put filmmaker's narration, you can make an essay film, or you can make a docudrama. There are lots of ways to make a documentary. Like I chose observational documentary. This documentary always need to work with limitations in terms of the production resources, relationship with the subject, and also our limited knowledge as well. As I said, it was my first time to go there, cover stories of fishermen. And after reviewing all the realistic constraints, I found observational documentary was the best way to deliver our message. As the character, as long as the character themselves are rich enough to show how they live, survive, affected by land reclamation, and there's a healthy enough to take us to different scenery, which is important. So one of the advantage of my film is that I have quite strong materials in hand before I go on location. And the strong research team from the funding body, Urban Diary, they already have a research team. So we worked together. They were going story covering 10 islanders, and they have already collect lots of stories. So for me, it's like they were doing casting for me. And I could read several stories before I choose who to shoot. And it was quite helpful, even though I haven't had any relationship built up with the characters. I already see them. And after reading all the story written down with articles, I feel like, oh, I know all of them quite well. And then when I went shootings, I went with a researcher. So the characters feel quite comfortable during the shooting as well. So I feel really grateful to have this strong backup when I was making this film. And also, I think being a documentary filmmakers choosing observational way to shoot documentary, it's also a way to show your humble attitude when you first see your characters. All the job you have to do is to help them articulate what they want to tell by asking appropriate questions. Yeah, so that's the most of the time I spent is doing interview with them and let them feel comfortable in front of the camera. And I spent 4 days shooting 2 characters. I spent 2 days in Peng Chau in the small island and 2 days in Causeway Bay. the busier area. And I found observational documentary could be quite powerful way to show the whole picture. So the character and the issue as well. And these two elements speak for themselves without mind. Quite presentable characters when I saw them in person. I have an instant that I didn't need to put any duration. So like, say for example, I can put emphasis on 3 points, which you might have watched the film, but let me put emphasize on 3 things that they mentioned to me. First, I think Mr. Lai, the fishermen who are still catching fish and selling seafood, he pointed out were quite important insights to people living in cosmopolitan life. How to live and survive with the nature. This is a topic we don't really know, and we spend very little time to think. Like Mr. Lai upholds his traditional principles to leave the small fishes and crabs as a traditional way of catching fish. Otherwise, you won't have anything to harvest in the end. And that scene for me was powerful because we don't quite remember when we're always chasing for economic growth in the city in exchange of consuming power, then forget about the consequence. Or we would think that we let the others or the environment to bear the consequence. And it was a quite good insight when you go back to the land. We had serious issues in Hong Kong, like wild boars. When the city is expanding so fast, nowadays we have less space for country park and jungle. And we have quite a lot of confrontations happens between residents and wild boar as well on the land. Sometimes human beings were being attacked by wild boars, and wild boars went to some rubbish bin searching for food from on the road, and we called the police when we felt helpless, and no one knows how to deal with that. And you cannot kill all of them because the speed that they reproduce themselves is so fast, and we can't stop them. Then how much resources should we spend on controlling the nature if you don't pay attention to that? And how much do we understand the nature? How much do we understand the relationship of our daily life with nature? And do we face the problem of how to live with the nature? So I think when I saw Mr. Lai, he brought up a quite important issues in a very gentle way, very down to earth. He just showed me how to catch a fish, and I think he told a very big message to people living in the city. And the second thing I think Mr. Lai pointed out is, I asked him, why do you want to be a fisherman? He said, because he has autonomy in everyday life in the city. It was quite a powerful statement for me, because have we ever thought of making a living without over-exploiting them ourselves? Right? He reminded us not to exploit the nature. He also reminded us not to over-exploit ourselves as well. Although Mr. Lai's way of life was quite ideal, and why Mr. Lai's way of life sounds a luxury to the city, people living in the city, it was quite insightful for me to review my labor conditions in all industry. And for the past few years, I think the COVID also gave us a chance to stop and rethink about it. And I hope that it will carry on. And the third things, I think the observational way of shooting this documentary is quite important. Is that, do we have a freedom or right to questions about the expansion of the city? And I chose not to present this film as an ideal picture of Islander, because I know the city expanding so fast in Hong Kong. And the second characters in Causeway Bay told the story of land reclamation and space control. Their livelihood used to rely on the sea, and nowadays they have to compromise, and why? Through observing these characters, I think they show our city has been exploiting the space of sea by increasing busy traffic and control of space in order to secure infrastructures, buildings like cross harbor tunnels, hotels in the harbor, exhibition hall in Wan Chai, and non-stop construction along the harbors. And while celebrating the land reclamation that boosts up the economic growth, did we ever see development from the perspective from islanders or from the sea? I thought it was quite insightful by observing. You just go on the boat and observe what they're doing. It will be powerful enough to show and make people think in retrospective as well. And I feel quite happy to see our exhibition this year. In this exhibition, we have many art pieces which we can grasp the perspective. Yeah, so that's why I chose this medium, observation documentary, mainly because I think these two characters are strong enough to tell the issues in the life from the sea perspective.
Thank you for that question, Ka Lee. It made me think of maybe the most interesting and impactful moment when I was working in Jeju was a speech at a small gathering. And one of the activists was talking about the obvious question that everyone on Gangjung has to answer, which is, why are you still there? So they had about 6 years struggling against this base, and then the base opens, and the base continues to be open, and it continues to operate. The US can bring in destroyers and aircraft carriers, and yet this is a daily kind of protest. And it was something that I was a little bit confused about as well. How do you get up every day and protest something that exists? And she talked that line, the struggle is the struggle is the struggle to keep going. That's her line, because everything around this town is built on how do you continue to maintain the difficult work of staying at something that is already built. And on one hand, it is memorial. So the Thursday that the first film refers to is the 10th anniversary of the expulsion of protesters from the Rock. They had been occupying the Rock for a couple of years, and the South Korean police took advantage of a typhoon and came in, and there was a brutal fight. People were severely injured, and they were expelled from the Rock. And so it was the 10th anniversary, and it has become a holiday, a holy day in that sense. And so we had an all-day occupation in front of the base, and that's where the first recording was taken. So there are those memorial aspects, but more importantly, the infrastructure of the town has built these places out of this daily resistance. So on one hand, the gathering place of the Rock has been lost, but on the other hand, the daily routine of protesting has built new places that are now the new gathering places. And all of these places take as their name or as their daily call some part of the Rock. So the community kitchen is named after a section of the Rock. There's a large banner that shows a picture of the Rock at the Catholic Mass tent. Each of these places maintains a little fragment of that place that was lost. And then the other part of the memorial is a kind of historical memory that I think islands are able to preserve, because while they are sites of such frequent colonization, they're also sites of such frequent decolonization. There are places that are left, that are abandoned, that are ignored, that are constantly fought over, but that fighting over leads to opportunities for change. And many of the activists can point to Altura Air Force Base, which is about 30 kilometers to the west. And it was a Japanese Air Force base that was used in the bombing of Nanjing. And it is now farms. Farms have grown over these bases, these airplane shelters. There are peace memorials there. There are memorials to the victims. and they're memorials to the victims of Japanese colonization. And the fantasy that the victory of one colonizer is permanent is part of the thing that maintains those colonizers. And so as a very practical political practice, it is maintaining an infrastructure of protest that will continue to fight and impede the base from expanding, because they were very successful at limiting the size of this base to something that's practically useless. And when the day comes that the military might want to expand, they have an infrastructure to combat that. They also have an incredibly long telos. The timeline that they are considering includes a date about 50 years in the future when one of their engineers has predicted that the seawall will fail and the typhoon will come in and the waters will be so damaging that the base will become not functional. And they're planning for that day 50 years in the future. So I think this memorial, this preservation of the past is both an anchor in a kind of memory as a tactic, but the tactic has a more concrete purpose, which is this 50 years in the future, or maintaining the infrastructure of protest to build against the base. And it also is part of this archipelago. It is part of this, how do you connect these struggles with the other bases? You need a kind of daily attention and awareness that builds those links. And I think what I was able to build is just not something that can be repeated or something that can be built, but to join in the practice of starting new traditions, even if it's for a month, having a single tradition of maintaining that memory as a practice in order to turn them into tactics. I think if they remain symbolic, then there is an implicit acceptance of the colonization that exists. And using those moments to think about the places where those have collapsed and those have failed, not just memorializing what's been lost that's dear to us, but memorializing what's been lost that's disturbing to us or that's hateful to us. Those are also memories that are very important to keep attention to.
Thank you so much for sharing, Grant and Freddie. So yeah, I think Grant mentioned a really good point about building links, right? Like today, like Hong Kong and Jeju, they're facing such different problems, but we will have to try to understand each other, or as Grant said, like we need this kind of awareness if we have to fight for this kind, or make visible the critical issues on islands. So here I would like to turn the attention particularly to sound and voices, because in both of your pieces, we all hear this sense of violence from different kind of expressions. Like in Grant's pieces, it will be like the striking ambient sounds, like the industrial noises, the car noise. And in Freddie's piece, we directly hear the fishermen telling their stories. So here I have two questions together, because we are actually running out of time. So I will just have these two questions together. You can choose to select which to speak about, or decide whatever that fits you. So the first question would be, what does speaking up mean in the context you talked about in Peng Chau or Causeway Bay or Kurumbi in Jeju? Do you think speaking up initiate any changes? So the other question is more about your positionality, because in both of your work, we do hear you speaking directly somehow. Like Freddie asking a question, we hear your voices, and of course in Grant's performance poetry, it is mostly you, and also you have another person, right? Like in the experimental one, so this gives a really personal touch to them. So how do you see your own personality in the issue you talked about? Like, what is your relationship with islands and ocean?
Yeah, maybe I can talk about this second question, the positionalities. Yeah. So like when I was shooting films, every single films, like at the interviewing underrepresented community, because shooting film really helped me strengthen my skills in building trust with underrepresented community in the island. Like 4 years later, after shooting the Fisherman's Discourse, I make another film called Rhymes of Shui House, as Leung Bo introduced in the beginning. Also with the same Urban Diary team, the production team in Southern Lantau on folk song. For this project, I could spend 8 months there, and I could practice what I have learned from the island, how to talk to people, and I further discover my positions and more commitment with the community that I spent time with. When I first approached them, people in Ireland, it's like, I was always asked for many times by islanders people, why are you coming here to the middle of nowhere? No one pays attention to us. Even our next generation don't speak our own dialects no more. So I always need to answer these kind of questions. Why do I want to make a film about them when they feel so lonely and their voices are unheard, and they feel, yeah, they don't even feel valued of their own cultures. But like, it was quite confused to me. But human being is like that. Trust can only be built if they actually can see you in person from time to time. So even though I was frustrated, you still keep going there, and they see you more. They will share different, stories from daily life, and you share your own background instead of only taking material from them, and they could feel it. So I think it is the things that I did. Try to talk to people who feels like their voices are unheard from anywhere, not just from Ireland. And I'm here to talk to you. I'm showing my commitment and empathy to the community while making the film. Even I'm now making a new film in Edinburgh, Scotland, about housing crisis here. I found that the skills I've learned from the island, it applies. It's just the same human being. You spend time with them. And apart from making films, what can we do to lead for further change? That's quite interesting. That will be about event organization or further screening activities. That what kind of action do you want to take? For islands, for the case of islands, I did quite a lot of screenings with the community members. They first feel quite helpless that their next generation don't even remember the language. But after you bring new people to Ireland and bring more people to see the grannies, the villagers in persons, they feel like, oh, the film helped us quite a lot to gain more respect, and the villagers can, they can cook something for the audience. They can prepare some community tour, tell their stories. That was a great chance for them to make connections. And the next generation, also some young islanders from the films, they experience this kind of event. And some of islanders, young islanders, I would say their thoughts have been changing by all this arts event. Like after you're making a film, you organize the event, we have discussions, and some of the young generation, they started thinking if they should move back to the island because farms, there's no more fishing industry there. What's the point to coming back to the village? And some of them decided to come back and started establishing some, education business, like youth hostels or art galleries, with all the messages they gather from the screening or through the shooting process. Because I always speak about my point of view about gentrification and land reclamations, and I let them know I never hide my point of view, my opinions on all these issues. And some of them, if they agree with that and they also sympathize with people still living there, or they're seeking alternative lifestyles in their career, they will always like to come back to the island. I think that is the change, which takes quite slowly, but I could see the real change. People are doing something real, yeah, with their real connection, family connections, community connections, with new thoughts. Because I think like there's some concepts like sustainability, it's quite global and universal. I think most of young generation have ever heard about that. And quite a lot of working class people, if they grew up in the village, they know what ideal life could be. But they just feel like we don't have alternative, that we go to the city. Yeah, so like making this kind of film, organizing community screenings, it will help making a connection with them, between them. And I could see the change. And the second aspect about change is that I could see the change in art scenes or academic community. More artworks, more voices have been gathered, get published, and more activities. And they write about this, they organize exhibitions, and that is another aspect in terms of change. But as I said, when I finished the first films, Fisherman's Discourse, it was 9 years ago. There were not much discussions, but like today in these discussions sessions, you can see the change takes place after 9 years, that we gather enough materials to make an exhibition. It takes quite a long time. Yeah, it takes a quite long time for these issues, for sea, for island. So yeah, I could see change, but it just takes time. And me as also as an actor in this process as well, organized activity, not just a filmmaker.
I think that last point Freddie made is something that's very important to me. I'm less interested in the content of my films and more interested in the fact that it promotes a conversation, or that I can show people here an issue with Gangjung that they're not aware of. And the same in Gangjung. One of the reasons I went there in the first place is that my art practice here in San Diego concerns flags, and they make flags like the Haegung Gechi Gyel Sabande, which is fight the naval base to the death, or oppose the naval base to the death. And I wanted to make flags with them. I wanted to bring what I was doing here to there and make that connection across the Pacific. So the organizing capacity of artworks is part of that speaking up and what it does to create a change. I don't know that it's always informative or always necessarily entertaining, although I don't strive to be irritating or boring. But the material aspect, I think that's the important part about speaking up. The other part about speaking up connects to that positionality. So you might have noticed I'm wearing a mask throughout the films. The films were shot in the middle of the most severe COVID lockdown in Korea. And so this protest, which had been succeeding at being every day in front of the space, was effectively banned because gatherings of more than 2 people were illegal, outside as well as inside. And so my showing up and arriving with these recordings was also my contribution to maintaining that. So we would have 1-person protests to come by, or 2-person protests to come by and maintain the daily practice. And sometimes there's usually a person off screen who's sort of helping me or shooting or taking pictures. And that contribution was what I tried to bring. And the position that I understood in Gangjung is a constant relentless creativity about finding ways to contribute a new position, a new standing. One of the very difficult contestations on Gangjung is between two terms. One is translated as sort of outside agitator, and the other is translated as person of concern, as are you a person who has the standing to oppose this military base? And Freddie mentioned cosmopolitanism before. Many of the protesters are not from the village originally. They've been there for 10 years, 11 years, 12 years, but they weren't born there. And they weren't born on Jeju, not all of them. So the question of, are they the ones who are allowed to speak for this town, or to speak for this rock, or to speak for this island, is a contested one. And one of the very important insights that I think they've built, that they've contributed to me, and that I think about a lot, is our ability to contest these issues that go beyond borders. Lun Po brought up the ocean as this unbordered or disbordered place. Where do we prosecute a protest against global warming? Where do we protest imperialism, these sort of nebulous, non-centered kind of objects, these places that also have no borders? And the innovation, or one of the innovations of the Gangjung protesters, is you find a site. You find a site that is at the intersection of all these forces, that is at the intersection of ecological destruction and militarization, and you relentlessly stay in that place. And you build a platform to speak to these issues. You build a platform to speak to imperialism. Every time there is a Korean, a joint Korean-US naval exercise, as there is this summer in RIMPAC, which is about, I think, 16 nations doing a military exercise in the Pacific, they're able to protest against this international event in the site because it is a proper site for this kind of protest. It's not incongruous. It's not, it seems it has become a natural site for that kind of contestation. So building the positionality is the entire point. How do you know, Freddie talks about this showing up, this personal contact. Without showing up every day, it's impossible to build that stability and to maintain that stability for very long. So again, this goes back to this struggle, is the struggle to stay, and how do people get stuck? It comes from creating new modes of engagement, creating new ways of figuring out how to stay and return, or figuring out new excuses to come and show up at the base when protesting has been banned. I think when those forces come together with the distribution and the coordination that art practices bring, you get something that can maintain that beyond the immediacy of showing up. And I think that's mainly what I tried to capture in those two films, is how can the showing up start to replicate itself on its own. My last comment that I'll make in this is one of my favorite anecdotes. When I was doing these performances, there's a guard. He's not an official. He's not a soldier. He's a hired guard because he has more leeway to hurt people effectively. I gave my first performance on a Friday, and I was saying today is September 2nd. Today is Thursday, and he came up to me at the end and he looked at me like I was an idiot. He says, "Today's Friday. What are you talking about?" And I realized that I had gotten him to say, he said, "Today is Friday. Today's not Thursday. Today is not September 2nd. And I realized I had gotten those words in his mouth too, even as a negation. And people kept coming up and they called me the Thursday guy. And I had gotten that word to replicate beyond my immediate context. And that was very important to me. And that's something that wasn't captured, but to get that speaking in someone else's mouth is valuable.
Thank you so much for sharing. So yeah, the question of like who has the right to speak up and like who is the local or person of concern, as Grant mentioned, these questions. But I think that's how it is so rewarding to bring together sound and ocean studies. I didn't really get to talk much about sinophone study or the sonic or the phonic, but one thing I want to quickly share is that like in some study, for example, that it is not about the routes and not about one's routes, but it is more about the routes one's take, like one's experience in living or experience one place, that we can allow more conversation and make alliance possible to initiate real changes. So thank you so much for sharing today. I think that now we have to open up the Q&A session, right? So if you have any questions, feel free to in chat box, or if Learnpo have any question, I think like you would have chance. Use that.
How popular is Jeju Islands now amongst the, I mean, active international activist communities, artist community? You know, on the one hand, Jeju has been promoted by Korean government as a quite, you know, leisure place, touristic spot. Yeah, if you want to spend holidays, it's the best place to buy fresh fruit, orange, and very good consume good nature. But on the other hand, I also heard that in Jeju, quite a lot of international, you know, activists, if they concerned about the situation in Korea, Jeju is the place that they must go whenever they visit Korea. So can you tell us more about how popular of Jeju's becomes, and yeah, how did you hear about Jeju that attract you from Americans go to Jeju and do your research and stay there with the people?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because it is the work of the Gangjang villagers that has built it as this place that international activists have to go. They were incredibly skilled at getting international attention on this base, particularly in the United States, and focusing the anti-war movement, which had kind of ground to a halt, in repositioning toward external naval bases and military bases outside the United States. I part of the reason that I went to Jeju and part of the reason I went to Gangjang is as a part of that activist struggle. So I began my research thinking about international tourism as a form of neo-colonialism and Korean control of Jeju as a form of neo-colonialism. Jeju's status as Korean is highly contested. Jeju speaks a different language. They had a final act, a civil war effectively in the late 1940s, where a tenth of the population was either killed or expelled. So the status as Korea's sort of beautiful natural spot comes from intentional underdevelopment. It comes from the mass destruction of villages by the Korean government under orders from the United States government, which is always important to emphasize. And so I came to talk about one kind of colonialization, and I ended up talking about another one. Now, the reason that I ended up in Gangjang was because I knew about this struggle from before. I had been to some of their rallies in 2016, But in 2016, because the base had opened. And that was the end. And I think that changed the Western till 25 that things were still happening and things that were very interesting were happening there. And so that's why I went specifically to Gangjeong that time. But the tourism element is central to both a new airport, which would double the tourists that I mentioned earlier. But on the other hand, it is a place of touristic protest, if that makes sense, both by Koreans, mainly by Koreans, but also by non-Koreans, as a place to create these chains of connection from, Okinawa to Jeju, or between the 4 sites of the main bases on Korea, making these loops of stopping in these places. So I think I answered your question, but yeah, I'll stop there.
Do you see any questions in the, okay. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing your insight tonight. And we learned definitely a lot more about Jeju, because I'm sure a lot of Hong Kong audience, including me, are not really aware of really what's going on. But I think it is a really great opportunity for us to connect Hong Kong island studies and also like Korean island study together. Maybe in the future we can also like have Grant and Fredie share their new work too, if they also like at one point Korean.
Oh, I saw one questions in the chat box, I think.
Oh,
From
okay.
Jan Lee. From Jan Lee.
I don't see it.
It's from the Q&A button on the bottom of the toolbar.
Oh,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah, if you click on that, you see the question.
Oh, that's great. Oh, that's great. You all can see it too, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
Maybe we can read out the question.
I think audience can join in. I think audience can join in if and we can have a more dynamic conversations. Never mind the formalities. Just that my connections here is very poor. I sometimes cannot hear you.
Oh, so the question is about positionality. So Jen asked about outsider intervention and the impact on the context. So the question will be, can outsider narrative and understanding of the site be valid to the locals if they are different? So I guess we can briefly address that too, right? We still have some time.
Yes. These questions, yeah, I think like for example, like for myself as a filmmaker, building relationship during the film production process, of course, we see each other quite often with characters, with interviewees, because the film production was going on. What I'm concerned is, it's that after the film productions, how would the relationship change? I collaborate with some of the villagers and try to bring the film to different places in the city and invite the villagers to go out and make connection with not only with audience, but also with audience, with villagers' agenda, if they would like to further develop, some project. What kind of connections, what kind of talents do they need from the village? so we can bring in more people to join and support them. And during this process, sometimes I also play a role as well. And but the most important thing is that the locals, you know, after the intervention, one-time interventions, how much they would like to take the initiative, because they are the characters, they are the, you know, they live there. And for us, it's like we can input a lot of ideas, we can input a lot of connections from different talents, and the change of relationship, it's quite important after the first intervention, I think, for artists, as well as scholar, academic, researcher as well. I think once your work's being published, then what's next? What's the progress? How to address the issues of island? And that will be the new challenge, I guess. There will be the challenge and new discussions all the time about positionality. As I said, some young generation has started new business. They decided to move back to the village with their professional knowledge, and I also need to read a lot of information and join in their discussion as well. Yeah, does our government policies encourage people to go back to the village, go back to the island? Does our government have good policy to support them instead of only encouraging, you know, the land and the fishing industry failing or helping them to transform their economy, transform the use of the land, property in a sustainable way? Can we bring them this agenda and try to expand the imagination in the village, in the island?
Thank you for the question, Jen. I think a very important distinction that you make there, and one that I think is difficult to overcome and important to surpass, is the insider-outsider. I will never be and don't seek to be an insider on Jeju or on Gangjung, but I do seek to be an insider in the Gangjung Village Peace Movement. And there will always be people in the town who resent me and reject me, and resent and reject the protesters. But those people don't resent and reject the military, who are also from outside. So that is, in one part, a rhetorical distinction. Those outsiders who disagree with me become outsiders, those who don't become insiders. So you're absolutely right. It is a very difficult and sensitive dynamic, but it is made much easier when you know the community that you're addressing those dynamics to. And it isn't everyone. It is, I know the people that I'm responsible to. I know the people that I don't want to disappoint. I know the people that I feel uncomfortable speaking on behalf of. And so I pause and I hesitate if I ever feel that I'm in that position. But I would say it's impossible to reject that distinction, but it's possible to say that that's a minor distinction, and the major distinction is the community that you work toward, that you feel responsible to. And very specifically in that sense of responsible, as in they can respond to me, but I also have a duty to respond to them and contribute and disagree and contest with them, because that's what an ally and a comrade does, is they respond to each other. So finding who you respond to is crucial to addressing any of these questions.
Yeah. Oh, Grant, I had an observation. If you mentioned about the connection between the people, or the, you know, outsider, insider. Protests in Hokkaido back in 2008, when the G8 took place there in Hokkaido. And there was a big protest rally, and I saw the islanders from Okinawa and also islanders from Jeju, they met with each other somewhere else. They don't, I mean, when we talk about insider, outsider, we always assume that the locals will always stay in the locals. That's it. They only concern about their own interests. But like, I think after the intervention from the outsider, somehow their knowledge or the way they see the world will be broader, and they can find a common ground or common interest from different islands as well. So I think that was a quite happy example to share. In Hokkaido, we saw the island from Okinawa and Jeju enjoy together. Yeah, and brought up the same issue as military base. They share the same issues and they talk to each other, and they join the same protests. So like they joined together in Sapporo in Hokkaido, and they travel together to the Toyako Lake, the meeting venues in Country Park. So all of them, they spend like 5 days together, and they met somewhere else. They don't just stay in Okinawa or Jeju.
Yeah, and I to go back to Lung Po's opening statement about the borderlessness of the water and the circulation of the water, the specific kind of alliances that are built are very transient. They aren't located in a center, which I think surprises some people, because islands ostensibly are, right, a center surrounded by water. But that's not how they function. They function as transits, they function as circulations, they function as places that you get on a boat and you leave from, and that the waves sort of ricochet away. I don't know if is there time for me to ask Fredie a question, and also maybe Ka Lee a question? Okay. Part of I think this leads into the question that I was curious about, which is the sound of the waves in your film. I thought about those waves and about this question of sound and about this question of island as the piece that connects them all together, both the sound waves, but also the reverberating connections that the water that bounces off of Jeju and the water that bounces off of Hong Kong reflect into each other. And there are these not especially obvious connections that the ocean can build that are sonic, that are a kind of constant sound, that are a shared sound. When I was listening to your film, I was taken to Jeju partly because I come from the middle of the United States. I come from Minnesota, about as far from an ocean as a human being can live without being in the middle of Russia. So when I hear water, it has a very intense feeling to me because I grew up without that sound. And to have the familiarity built on that sonic palette and that shared physical space is interesting. And so I wanted to ask both of you about the wave and about the sound of the wave and how you connect that to this question of sound and island and archipelago.
You want to start first, Fredie, or I guess I can give a very brief comment. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I can give.
Hello. Yeah, I can hear you. But I have a gentle reminder. We're running out of time, and we don't want to keep our technical staff staying for too long. And maybe it's time for us to round up here, and then let me try if we some of us like to stay. Maybe let me set up another Zoom, and then I post the link here. Would that be okay?
Yeah, sure.
Why? Yeah, so please go ahead, Ka Lee.
Yeah, I just have a very, very brief comment about sound and sonic and how and see. You can hear me, right? Okay. So yeah, I always believe that, like, to me, sound studies is like to hear we need, or to listen we need a subjective position, and every individual when they hear, they carry their own stories, memories, and also history. So I think that this is a really good way for us to maybe problematize what we have talked about, like positionality, right? Like, so in that sense, like, who become qualified? So I think like this is maybe one key that we can bring together, like sonic and also like island studies. So I don't want to occupy too much time. So I would just pass to Fredie right now to quickly respond the question, the amazing question.
I don't have much to add in this in these questions. Yeah.
Okay, so why don't Learn Paul? You said you want to make a remark, right? And Chloe will.
I have, yeah, I have the feeling that we just warm up, and then we the conversation just touch on a very important part, that is the intersection between island studies and sonic studies. And there are lots of overcrossing because they are both situated, they are both very paradoxical, and they are both very fluid. So I personally, I really like to have more time to maybe touch on the inter-Asia possibilities for solidarity or movement, and also because Grant mentioned earlier, because when he arrived in Jeju, is the end of protests, and it seems to be a catchphrase for us today because of COVID and the political situation in various continents. It feels like it's end of the protest, but is that really the end of everything, or what? Is there still anything we can do? But unfortunately, I don't think we have the time. The time is not allowed for us to continue the conversation. Maybe, and I'm trying to set another link, but seems that I am not able to do so because I'm in this Zoom. So if anyone like to be connected and have continue with the conversation, should we move on to let's see, what will be good? Should we move on to Facebook perhaps? Then where we can keep the vibe going on. And Chloe, do you have closing remarks about the events and on behalf of WMA?
Yes, I think, yeah, I should say thank you to everyone for joining the discussions and the sharing from you all. I want to share, I just post the exhibition link of the island exhibition. I guess I really appreciate what Fredie just mentioned, that the changes takes time. So that's why I guess that explains why WMA wants to present a half-year programs and exhibitions that focus on island studies as well, because we realize that there are so many things that we can do. There are so many stakeholders we can keep engaging. So yeah, so everyone in Hong Kong, please feel free to check out the latest exhibitions that are now displaying in WMA space. It is about the isolation nature as well as the neighboring nature of the islands in Hong Kong. So please check them out, and I look forward to seeing you all in the space. So as Lambo mentioned, maybe for those who are interested, or even anyone here in the panel, if you want to just join the discussion with these two directors and with our moderators, please maybe move to Lambo's Facebook to continue the discussions. Thank you. So
thank you, Ka Lee. Thank you, Fredie, so much, and thank you, Lung Po and Chloe and the WMA. This was very interesting, and I appreciate being able to talk about this.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. We'll see you later.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.